Hartmut Kahl from the Foundation for Environmental Energy Law in the southern part of Germany. You're based, and Hartmut Kahl worked as a lawyer in a big law firm, and well, one day he decided to say, well, I want to do research concerning renewable energies and so on. And yeah, you're working since how long, Hartmut, now for the foundation?
Almost 10 years.
10 years. Whoa, time is passing by. Yeah, you had your first speech in 2014 at our legal workshop with Taylor Wessing at Hamburg. So time is going by. So yeah, maybe you present yourself a little bit and then go on, and I'm happy to listen to you and your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon from Berlin. I'm in Berlin now. I'm happy to be invited to introduce you into that historic decision by Germany's Federal Constitutional Court. I'm happy to see many old and dear friends among us, but also a lot of new colleagues interested in that topic. I have an excuse in advance. I have to leave right after my presentation, and that isn't because I wouldn't be interested in the other presentations, but my next online session is just ahead. So sorry for that. I have to leave. The decision by Germany's Constitutional Court is quite historic. It's really a milestone in recent constitutional history. And yeah, the decision is quite long. It has over 100 pages, so one is tempted to conclude too long, didn't read. But actually, a lot of us in Germany very diligently studied that judgment. And right now, I try to give you in a nutshell what are remain topics, remain reasons of that decision. Tobias just mentioned that the complaint was filed by dozens of complainants, most of them children or minors. And they said in their argumentation that Germany's Federal Climate Change Act is insufficient to reach the Paris obligations from the Paris Agreement, and therefore the federal government, federal legislator, infringes our fundamental rights. So that was the main argument in this complaint. And that is why I just want to give you a short introduction to that Climate Change Act. It's a quite new act. It's just 2 years old. And the Climate Change Act pursues the long-term goal of greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050. And greenhouse gas emissions must be, according to that act, be gradually reduced by at least 55% by 2030. And it sets out annual allowable emission amounts for various sectors: industry, energy, heating, mobility, agriculture, and so on. And these amounts are in line with the reduction quota for 2030. And now, the surprising fact, provisions applicable beyond 2030 were not contained in this act. So it had really a gap of 20 years between 2030 and 2050. That's important to know. And the first prong, so to say, the decision is based on as Tobias said in his introduction, is based on fundamental rights. And so we have in the German constitution, which is called basic law for historical reasons, we don't have to waste time on now. In Article 20, in Article 2, Section 2 of this basic law, as the German constitution, it says every person shall have a right to life and physical integrity. And the Constitutional Court said the state's duty of protection encompasses the duty to protect life and health against the risk posed by climate change, including climate-related extreme weather events. And it can furthermore give rise to a duty to protect future generations. So right here, the court says, out of this fundamental right, the state has a duty to protect future generations from the risk of climate change. But the court also said, we cannot ascertain that the legislator has exceeded its decision-making scope insofar. The legislator does not fail to pursue the goal of climate neutrality at all, nor does he allow climate change to simply run its course. So the judges said, yes, from a fundamental right position, future generations have a right to live and to physical integrity, and that's the first important sentence. But if we look what the legislator has done so far, we cannot see what he has done not enough. So we see that the legislator has still a decision-making scope, and the judges said the legislator acts within this decision-making scope. And furthermore, the judges said additional protection can be also provided in the form of adaptation measures in order to protect fundamental rights against the risk posed by climate change. So we say the legislator does something at all. He doesn't allow climate change to simply run its course. That's the first point. And the second point is there are also adaptation measures by which future generations can be protected against the risk of climate change. So up to here, it's quite disappointing, but it's not my last slide. The court also said that fundamental rights are violated by the fact that the emission amounts allowed until 2030 substantially narrow the remaining options for reducing emissions after 2030, and thereby jeopardizing practically every type of freedom protecting by fundamental rights. So the judges create a new figure of argumentation under German fundamental rights, the so-called intertemporal guarantees of freedom. The court says, as intertemporal guarantees of freedom, fundamental rights afford the complainants protection against comprehensive threats to freedom caused by the greenhouse gas reduction burdens being unilaterally offloaded onto the future. Yeah. So they say, legislator, you have done something, but only until 2030, and that's not enough. Now is the question, where comes the obligation to mitigation actually from? It's not in the first course from the fundamental rights, but it's Article 28, 20A of our basic law of our German constitution. Article 20A is not a fundamental right, but a general constitutional principle, and it says, mindful also of this responsibility towards future generations, the state shall protect the nature foundation of life. And from this general constitutional principle, the judges derive the obligation to mitigation. So Article 28 places the state under an obligation to take climate action and is aimed at achieving climate neutrality. The obligation to take climate action is accorded increasing weight as climate change intensifies. So the duty to act becomes even more severe as the climate change goes on. And then the court says, since global warming is a worldwide phenomenon, Article 28 obliges the state to involve the supranational level in seeking to resolve the climate problem. The state cannot evade its responsibility by pointing to greenhouse gas emission in other states. One of the big excuses we have heard so far. Other countries aren't doing more ambitious actions, so we don't have to. And then there's another important point coming from temperature to budget. So as you all know, the Paris Agreement sets a temperature goal and not a remaining budget. And the court says right here, since the legislator itself has chosen to ratify the Paris Agreement, its obligations are the threshold for Article 28, to which he must stick now. So Article 28 as itself doesn't say climate neutrality or Paris Agreement, but as insofar as the legislator has ratified the Paris Agreement, he incorporated the Paris Agreement into the national constitution of Germany. So what's the argumentation? And when they say the constitutionally relevant temperature threshold of well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius can in principle be converted into a remaining global CO2 budget, which in the next step can then be allocated to states. So we actually transfer the temperature goal into a remaining budget for the world, and in the second step for Germany per capita. And using the emission amounts stipulated in the Climate Change Act, the remaining budget calculated on the basis of the IPCC estimates would be largely used up by the year 2030. So the judges say there is a remaining budget for Germany. And if we stick to the Climate Change Act, German legislation has just passed, the budget is largely used up in almost 10 years. And that's why the court comes to the full conclusion. The judges say one generation must not be allowed to consume large portions of the remaining budget while bearing a relatively minor share of a reduction effort if this would involve leaving subsequent generations with a drastic reduction burden and expose their lives to comprehensive losses of freedom. They say at some point in the future, even serious losses of freedom may be deemed proportionate and justified under constitutional law in order to prevent climate change. However, since the current provisions on allowable emissions amounts have now already established a path to future burdens of freedom, the impacts on future freedom must be proportionate from a today's perspective. And furthermore, the court says Article 28 encompasses the necessity to treat the natural foundations of life with such care and to leave them in such condition that future generations who wish to continue preserving these foundations are not forced to engage in radical abstinence. And so the court comes to the ruling saying that the risk of serious burdens is significant and can only be reconciled with potentially affected fundamental rights if precautionary steps are taken to manage reduction efforts anticipated after 2030 in ways that respect fundamental rights. The court says it also requires initiating the transition to climate neutrality in good time. In specific terms, this means that transparent guidelines for the further structuring of greenhouse gas reduction must be formulated at an early stage, providing orientation for the required development and implementation processes in conveying a sufficient degree of developmental urgency and planning certainty. And here is the imperative under constitutional law that further reduction measures are defined in good time for the post-2030 period, extending sufficiently far into the future. Moreover, the court says, further annual emission amounts and reduction measures must be defined in such detail that sufficiently specific orientation for the future is provided. And right here you can see, if you remember my first slide, showing the gap between 2030 and the climate neutrality in 2050, the court explicitly says you can't afford as legislator to have such a big gap of 20 years where people do not know what comes next. And first of all, the generation living now is not entitled to consume the remaining budget in the next 10 years, leaving an even more bigger share or burden for future generations in the post-2030 period. So the court, in its ruling, said the legislator has to amend the Climate Change Act until December 22 by establishing a path for the periods beyond 2030. And surprisingly enough, the parties forming our government, so Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, they were somehow happy and eased reading the decision and instantly reacted, amending the Climate Change Act, even though it would be good enough to do it until December 22, but they just did it the last weeks. So, and the amended act, the amended Climate Change Act of Germany right now establishes the goal of greenhouse gas neutrality not by 2050, but instead by 2045, 5 years earlier. We have a 2030 target of minus 88% greenhouse gas emissions, which was in the former version, not in the law. We have intermediate targets for 2031 to 2040, and we have yet indicative sectoral targets for 2035 and 2040. And the Climate Change Act right now says we will fix the period 2031 to 2040 in 2024, 1 year earlier than in the former version of the Act. And the final 5 years, 2041 to 2045, will be fixed in the beginning of the 2030s. So we really try to stick to the ruling of the Constitutional Court, planning in advance, telling people in advance what comes next, and trying to make clear that the remaining budget and the burden for future generations is not postponed, but that we have to deal with that in our decade right now. Yeah, that is the decision of Germany's Constitutional Court in a nutshell. That's it for my presentation, and I'm happy to hear your comments and questions.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Hartmut. Maybe you don't have a lot of time, but I would like to ask you personally, have you been surprised by the decision, or did you await the decision, or?
I was really surprised, and a lot of my colleagues, our colleagues in our federations surely too. It was really a breaking news this morning that the Constitutional Court has decided that way, because yeah, you can say that the wave of successful climate litigation has reached Germany and wasn't predicted. That we had seen other decisions by minor courts rejecting such claims. That's why it was really surprising.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Tobias, I take back over from you.
Yes.
From my side, also thank you very much, Hartmut. And then I would also like to refer everyone here to the chat window. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write your questions, of course, comments as well in the chat window, so that we can also refer the speakers to that, or also, of course, discuss this at a later point of time. Tobias, you also here included a small survey, which maybe you can just retype that website, which you ask participants here to contribute to. Well, I think that was an excellent introduction into what the German Federal Constitutional Court has decided. Thank you so much. And what we already hear from you is that it's a huge breakthrough. It's changing somehow the way we've been looking at constitutional law, and will certainly have a long-term impact. What we expect and what we hope, of course, that this impact is not only within Germany, also beyond Germany. And that brings us to our next speaker,